Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our weekly seminar series. I'm really pleased and delighted to introduce Aram Sinnreich. Close?
Close.
Yeah, it wasn't quite right. We just went over it, too.
Let's just rewind. Aram Sinnreich.
Aram Sinnreich. There we go. Said it so easily that time. He's from American University and the School of Communication there. He's the author of a lot of influential books and other works, but most recently, he's published this, The Secret Life of Data. And one of the things I love about all of his works, and I think some key threads that go through it, is tracing how popular music, as an example, something that I care a lot about, can reveal insights about data and what they mean for us. Today, in this latest work with Jesse Roberts? Gilbert, again, so close, but so far. Is one of the really interesting takes on how to think about data, not just in the moment, but long term. And so when we saw this book come out, we were really excited that he'd come and join us. Please join me in welcoming Aram to the talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm just going to get right into it because I know we have a limited amount of time. So when Jesse and I use the term the secret life of data, it's actually a very simple concept that shouldn't need explaining, but for some reason it does. And it actually began as an academic article that the two of us published in 2019 in the International Journal of Communication. And back then we called it the carrier wave principle, which sounds very academic-y and techy. And for that reason, like nobody outside of academia was ever going to read it or learn about it. And we decided this is too important an idea to kind of keep hidden inside of the ivory tower. So we decided to rebrand it as The Secret Life of Data and pitch it as a book that would be work equally well as an academic book and a trade book. And it's all really built around this one simple observation that is, despite its simplicity and its frank obviousness, is really underappreciated in the general conversation about data industries, data processes, data-oriented technologies and services, and the consequences that they have for our society and our culture and our politics. And the basic idea is this, and I'm just gonna, this is the only time in this presentation I'm gonna read right off the slide. I promise you, I'm not one of those guys. But we really workshop the wording, so I wanna make sure I say it right. There's no limit to the amount and variety of data and ultimately knowledge that may be produced from an object, event, or interaction given enough time, distance, and computational power. Or put in much simpler terms, when we think about data, we tend to talk about its first-order consequences, and we ignore the fact that data has no expiration date, and it has second-order, third-order, n-way order consequences that can be completely orthogonal to or even opposite to the purposes that it was originally collected for. So if you'll forgive me, I really hate the trope of ones and zeros against a dark background and a monochrome monitor, but it's very useful for giving presentations. If you think about a discrete quantum of data, it gets collected in a particular time and place by a particular entity for a particular purpose, and we're used to this happening in our daily lives for all kinds of reasons. Websites can collect data about us for advertising targeting. Our governments can collect data about us in order to surveil and control us. Criminals can collect data from us in order to steal our ID. But it doesn't end there. After those entities collect the data, we don't actually know what happens downstream. Who gets it next? Maybe that criminal sells their data into a broader network. Maybe that ad targeting firm gets acquired by a bigger tech firm. Maybe that machine learning model gets integrated into a piece of hardware or software. And beyond that, those secondary uses get put into dialogue with one another. So data collected by one entity for one purpose gets mixed with data collected by another entity for another purpose, and those interaction effects are also unpredictable. And that continues to ramify and ramify and ramify because, as I said before, data have no expiration date. And so the downstream consequences of this rampant collection, analysis, storage, and weaponization of data are not only unpredictable, but wreak havoc on us. And because of those unpredictable consequences, all of the technical and regulatory safeguards that we're busy advocating for have very little long-term power. So this is going to seem like a kind of a downer of a presentation, and I promise you the book is not. Jesse and I put a ton of work into trying to look at the bright side, and there's going to be some glints of that in this presentation. So when I say data have no expiration date, that's not a natural feature of data. Data could have an expiration date, but the main reason they don't, this is kind of one of those laws like Moore's law. You know, you're Stanford tech people, you all know what Moore's law is, right? But Moore's law is not a fact about computer processors or a fact about the economy. It's a fact about the interaction between computer processors and the economy. Moore's law happens because economic factors drive computer processor manufacturers to continue to double the strength of their processors every 18 months for economic reasons. And the same is true of the lack of an expiration date for data. This is obviously a chart of the cost of data storage over time, and as you can see, it's fallen precipitously. Oh, crap. Oh, you missed all my amazing graphics. I really suck, I apologize. I should be better at this by now. Wow! That's why I didn't see that. Okay, so this is where I'm at now with data have no expiration date. And again, this is the process of Moore's law played out in terms of the cost of data storage, but over time, that changes the incentives for data collectors. So we interviewed dozens of people in the process of writing this book, and one of them was the head of a location data brokerage. And he explained to us like 99.9% of the location data that they collect has no direct use. They have no business model for it. But data is so cheap to store now that they know that over the long term, actuarially, the odds of some of it having some kind of economic value are greater than the cost of holding on to it with this increasingly cheap storage. So their default is just to collect everything they possibly can and never get rid of it and just count on the fact that they're going to be able to dive deeper and deeper into the database over time. The second big takeaway from the book is what we shorten to the phrase, all data are big data. About 15 years ago, big data was a big buzzword in our field and associated fields, and everybody was talking about how the dynamics of having a giant database that's larger than traditional libraries and information services changed the qualitative nature that data plays in our lives. And you can see what we don't acknowledge is that in a networked world, where there are second and third and fourth and n-way order consequences of data collection, there's no longer any such thing as small data. I could do a survey of the 100 or so people in this room right now, and 20 years ago, the survey would have ended there. Maybe I would have published an article based on it, but that was it. But now, I could collect survey data from you, and I could combine that with survey data that I've taken at all the other universities that I've given talks to, and then I could take those data and I could publish them online, and they could be recombined with other data sets ad nauseum. So anytime you collect a set of data or a piece of data, you don't actually know that it won't be subject to the principles, the qualitative changes that are wrought by big data. And I can give you a few examples of how this works. So one of the things we start the book out talking about is metadata. And a great example of metadata, which I don't need to define for you because this is Stanford, is the nearly invisible tracking printer dots that every commercial laser printer puts in faint yellow ink on every piece of paper that gets printed on all of those printers. And those dots are not visible to the naked eye, but they contain all kinds of information about like what the serial number of your printer is, who printed it, where it was printed, at what time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That has unexpected consequences in cases like Reality Winner, who very famously went to prison for violating state secrets when she printed out what she saw was proof that Russia had interfered in the American presidential election in 2016 and mailed that report to The Intercept, to a journalist named Glenn Greenwald. And Glenn Greenwald fact-checked the story by making a PDF of what she had sent him and sending it to the NSA and saying, is this true? But of course, the PDF of the printout of the report still contained the tracker dots, And Reality Winner was arrested 2 days before The Intercept ever published the story. We don't actually know, but we think probably because of the tracker dots. And Jessie and I actually downloaded the report that she published in The Intercept, and we changed the contrast, and we analyzed the tracker dots ourselves, and we were able to see exactly when and where and by whom this report was printed out. So that's one example of one piece of data that's not considered a piece of big data, just a very small piece of data, metadata about a particular object that becomes a piece of big data due to unexpected consequences. Another example would be up-resolution tools, right? Now, so-called AI allows us to take fuzzy, low-res images and up-res them, but because of the biases in our larger data sets, the process of up-resing can have unintended consequences. Most famously, somebody on Twitter a few years ago took this up-resing application and demonstrated how it turns what's very clearly a low-res photo of Barack Obama into a high-res AI-generated photo of some white dude who doesn't exist. And obviously, this is a great example of how training data biases lead to output biases in our AI systems. Another great example, I don't know about the faculty here, but in my university we are encouraged to use plagiarism protection software like Turnitin. I don't because I'm not a narc. But the existence of this software basically reverse engineers large libraries of published papers and academic work and allows you to see whether a student is passing off someone else's work as their own. That has now been weaponized in several high-profile cases where people like Jill Abramson, who is the executive editor of the New York Times, or Claudine Gay, who was the president of Harvard University, have lost their jobs because they were credibly accused of plagiarizing based on these tools that were made for this very small data set in these very specific institutional contexts being weaponized by people outside of that context on much larger data sets. Another great example is photo blurring. When Google Street View first rolled out, there was a lot of outcry, especially in Europe, especially in Germany, about the surveillance and privacy concerns of having cars mounted with camera arrays driving around every city street and taking photos of pedestrians and publishing them forever online. So Google decided to get out in front of it and created an algorithm that blurred things like people's faces and license plates. And now, all of these large public archives of location-based photography have algorithmically blurred out images. That's great until you discover that blurring certain things makes them stand out. Like, for instance, military bases are now very easy to identify because if you're looking in a sensitive area and you see a blurred building, you can be pretty sure that's a sensitive object, right? So in a data-rich environment, the absence of data becomes kind of a sore thumb that sticks out. Okay, point number 3. All apps are Trojan horses. What do Jessie and I mean by that? Well, first of all, we're not talking about the species of malware that's referred to as Trojans. We're also not just repeating the old saw that, if you sign up for Facebook and Facebook is free, that means you're the product. I mean, obviously that is true. But what we mean is something different. When you buy a refrigerator, let's talk about like old-fashioned pre-networked refrigerators, which why the hell would anybody ever want to do Twitter from the refrigerator? But when you buy a refrigerator, that's the end of the consumer product cycle. You buy the fridge, it uses this many BTUs, it has this much storage space, it has this many crisper drawers. You know exactly what you're getting. You install it in your house, and for the next 10 or 20 years, that's the fridge that you've got. But software doesn't work that way. Because software is networked, because software is data reliant, the thing that you invite into your life, whether it's software itself or a hardware device that's software dependent, its function can be changed at any point in the post-consumption life cycle of the object. Now, that's sometimes a really good thing. So there's a city app in the city of Kyiv in Ukraine that was created in order to help people pay parking tickets and find parking lots and do parking-related things. And when Russia invaded Kyiv a few years ago, which you're all familiar with, the mayor of the city actually changed the function of the application so that people could use it to find bomb shelter and to get breaking information about where violence is occurring and to get access to public resources. That is a socially positive use of the fact that that all apps are Trojan horses. However, the much more common consequence of this is much more weaponized and negative. Think about, like, for instance, the role of period tracking apps and menstrual calendars, which in the wake of the Dobbs decision outlawing abortion in dozens of American states, has essentially turned women's private medical records into evidence of felony. And in some states, women can even be tried for murder for seeking abortions. So again, this kind of once we've already integrated these services into our lives, their function can change drastically because of that secret role of data. Another consequence we talk a lot about in the book is the consequences for authorship. Now, ChatGPT launched as we were writing this book. So this is something we were already thinking about, but then we had like the perfect opposite example to talk about while we were writing the book. If you go way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes actually compared God to an author. And this was not a piece of flowery metaphor. This was a very real statement. The concept of authorship as we think about it, as is instantiated in our copyright laws, instantiated in our creative economies, instantiated in the popular imagination, basically did not exist prior to the Enlightenment. We didn't think of individuals as having unique points of view that were somehow sui generis, theirs and theirs alone. We considered culture as something that emerged collectively from society, and only with these new modes of monetization of creative labor, like copyright, like publishing industries, did we begin to assign individual perspectives to individual people. And it just so happens that the apogee of this shift in our philosophy was the founding of the United States, which is the first country in the world ever to have intellectual property written into its DNA. Like Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the US Constitution gives Congress the power to grant individual authors control over their works and inventors. And that was based on this notion that there's something that individuality, that liberalism in the political sense is akin and dependent upon authorship. And as soon as we begin to rethink what authorship means, right now there have been court cases in the last year that have sought to establish that ChatGPT and Midjourney can be authors, and that they can possess copyrights. Once we begin to roll that back and we start to ask the question, can an algorithm be an author? What we're really asking in not so coded terms is, can an algorithm be a person? Because authorship and personhood are considered to be philosophically and legally equivalent. In fact, copyright law, the only reason that the only case that's made it to a decision so far has failed is the judge said that the law literally says copyright can only be granted when it's made by a natural person, and ChatGPT is not a natural person. But there are billions of dollars in potential lawsuits that are seeking to reverse that decision. They'll probably go up to the Supreme Court at some point in the next few years, and keep a close eye on that because obviously individuality and authorship and personhood are essential to our whole definition of democracy, right? One person, one vote. What does it mean when a person is not one of the human beings sitting in this room? Another major idea that comes out in our book is what Jesse and I call algovision. And again, back when this was an academic paper in 2019, we called it informatic subjectivity, which is much more precise, but much less fun to say. And the basic idea of algovision is this. We begin to, as we become acculturated to being surrounded by data collection and processing algorithms, we begin to internalize their logic. And it begins to change the way that we understand who we are and what our relationship to one another is. And we begin to anticipate the ever-present surveillant eye of the algorithm, and that begins to change our identities and our behaviors and our modes of self-expression. Now, that can have really traumatic consequences for people. I'm going to begin with the downside this time. Very famously, Frances Haugen from Meta leaked some internal documents that demonstrated the psychological toll of platforms like Instagram on adolescent women. There's a new diagnostic condition called Snapchat dysmorphia, where the beauty filters that are based in these social media interfaces are beginning to make people increasingly dissatisfied with the way that their bodies actually look. And during COVID, plastic surgery skyrocketed in popularity. And it was like everybody else was going out of business. All my favorite restaurants closed, but there are all of a sudden 10 times as many plastic surgeons opening up their shingles. And the reason for that is Zoom. Everybody saw themselves on Zoom and was like, oh my God, is that what I look like? Oh, you know. So we begin to, and it doesn't just apply to the photographic dimension of it, though. You know, it's now a common trope that, you know, I was watching a TV show last week, I forget what it was, but one of the characters was like, oh no, if I click on my friend's baking video, all I'm going to get from now on is baking videos. Right? And so I don't want to, as much as I like this friend, I don't want to click on their video because like I don't want to mess up my algorithm, right? And you're all nodding and laughing because we're all thinking that way all day, every day, right? And that is like a tremendous delegation of what used to be a very intimate and very communal process of identity formation to these opaque algorithms that are arbiting what information flows and where. In a way that feeds back into our internal processing of our own selves. Now, the upside of AlgoVision is that it's also a superpower. Once you have internalized the algorithmic gaze, you can game the algorithmic gaze, and there's all kinds of wonderful examples. Some of it is very kind of, you know, still outre. I have a recently turned 16-year-old, and they went to the No Kings rally. I live in Washington, D.C. And before they went to the No Kings rally, they looked up online how to do surveillance blocking makeup, and because they're a brilliant visual artist, they did this incredible job. I should probably put it in this presentation. But you can, you know, there are people who are now spoofing facial recognition algorithms. But on a more basic level, like I have a sister who is also an academic, and we wrote a science fiction novel together that was published 2 years ago. And you know, whenever we get on Zoom together, she starts going like this. And at first I was like, Rachel, what are you doing? Like, you know, are you palsied? What's the matter with you? And she's like, oh no, I'm just, my smartwatch is telling me to stand up, so I'm telling it that I'm standing up, right? And so is that agentic or not, right? Is Rachel's behavior being refigured by the algorithm, or is she gaming the algorithm to get what she wants? Well, increasingly, as these algorithms, as the purveyors of these smartwatches make deals with insurance companies, and your insurance rates get lower if you demonstrate that you've spent a certain amount of time exercising per day, this becomes a resistant act, where you're gaming the algorithm in order to lessen the amount of money that you owe the insurance company. I realize this is not something I should do on video where anybody with access to an algorithm can, anyway. But there's all kinds of great examples of people who are fighting back against algorithms in all kinds of very creative ways. My favorite is the putting a smartwatch on a drill bit and just squeezing the trigger of the drill. Okay, another big idea that comes out of the book is this notion that what we call all the world is a stack. And again, I'm at Stanford. I don't need to explain what the stack is, but this is one of the foundational metaphors of our current socio-technical world, where we have this notion that, you know, at the very root, there's this kind of physical infrastructure, and then systems of computation are stacked on top of it and stacked on top and stacked on top of it. And the end result of that, the terminus of that stack, is the user interface. Right? So the moment of reception, where the information goes to the end user, that's the end of the stack. But now that our bodies and our physical environments are networked through biomedical implants, through pervasive surveillance devices, through resident wireless networks, you can really think of the entire physical world as being an element in the stack as well. And now we have this kind of fractal stack, where human bodies and, you know, think about, like, for those of you who have smartphones, you take a photo and your phone tells you, well, that's your mom, and that's your pet iguana, and that's this kind of a tree, and that's that kind of a flower, right? You've got this kind of resident surveillant architecture that is identifying every individual artifact that takes place in physical space and keeping track of where it is, whose it is, what the interrelationships between them are. And that means that when we think of the technological stack, when we think about how data gets passed from level to level, we have to include the physical components of it, not just the physical components of the compute infrastructure, but the physical components of the human world that we inhabit. We are data objects now. This jacket is a data object, right? That has all kinds of unexpected consequences as well. So if you think about like, I've already mentioned facial recognition. It's a hot button subject, and it leads to some interesting consequences, as do DNA databases. When we think about facial recognition, one of the obvious consequences is state surveillance, right? We can now track people walking down the street, and Israel has been doing this in Gaza, and Russia's been doing it in their subways, and ICE has been doing it on the streets of Chicago and elsewhere, Washington, D.C. They now have, visors with built-in facial recognition, augmented reality. DNA databases have also led to all kinds of consequences. Like, for instance, in the book, we interview a woman who found out she had a sibling that she never knew about because not she, but her aunt had submitted her DNA to 23andMe. But what she found out was that her father had had a child out of wedlock, and her father was a devout Catholic, and so this was a huge challenge for their family structure and their family culture. Neither she nor her father had entered into this compact with 23andMe. Her aunt had done it. So we're all kind of unwitting narcs, information narcs, on the people that we're networked to, because all data are big data. When you share your DNA, you're also sharing your family's DNA. When you're allowing someone to track your traffic, you are also participating in a system that tracks everyone's traffic. When you post a selfie to a social media site, it's also going to tag the people in the background of that selfie. But the most unexpected consequences are what happen when these different information regimes are used in conjunction with one another, and that's exactly what's been happening in China for the last couple of years, where they are combining DNA analysis of large-scale populations with facial recognition analysis of large-scale populations, and creating what's been casually referred to as ethnic alarms. One of the ethnic minorities in China, the Uyghurs, that has been the most surveilled. There are about 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps out of a population of about 11 million Uyghurs total in China right now. And the Chinese government, with the aid of American tech companies, many of them donors to your institution and mine, have been building these alarms that use what they call DNA phenotypes, where they analyze, like, what are the likely, if we look at all the DNA of this large population of Uyghurs, what are the likely facial features of those Uyghurs? Then they program facial recognition apps to identify people who have those likely kinds of features, and then they empower police to intercept people on the street and send them to concentration camps. And that is almost definitely going to happen with ICE if it's not happening already inside the United States. I don't mean to pick on China. They were just ahead of the game on this one. But this can only happen as a second-order consequence of these two forms of theoretically unrelated data surveillance. Okay, we're getting near the end, and then we're going to do some Q&A. Hopefully, if you have Qs, I will have As. Democracy. What does this mean for democracy? Well, if you think about it, democracy has always been an algorithmic process, right? How do we choose our presidents, our senators, our congresspeople, our mayors, our school boards? We vote for them, and then we count the votes. But it's more than that. We have to figure out how to district, right? Right now, America's at war, right? Texas is gerrymandering to make more Republicans in Congress. So California is gerrymandering to make more Democrats in Congress, right? All of that is algorithmic manipulation that drastically predates the digital era. This has been going on since we had to create the system of government in the first place. But because democracy is inherently algorithmic, the secret life of data and these algorithmic systems are uniquely capable of messing with the infrastructure of democracy. And this happens in all kinds of ways. One of the stories that we talk about in the book is this guy, Edward Snowden. Somebody tell me what Edward Snowden did in 2013, why we all recognize his face and his name, hopefully? Yes?
Read secrets of the NSA that were using to track citizens in the US and beyond.
Yeah, so he leaked secrets about how the NSA and the Five Eyes partners of the United States were engaging in mass unconstitutional and illegal surveillance of their own citizens. But he also did something else that we've all conveniently forgotten about. He leaked the tool that the NSA was using in order to do all that tracking. And he open sourced it. And he gave it to, for instance, Russia, where he now lives. And I know, you don't even remember that, but that was part of the story in 2013, right? So since then, we have been in essentially a data Cold War around the globe where, on an ongoing basis, there are antagonistic data relations between all the major superpowers and some countries that are hitting way above their weight, like Israel and North Korea, where at any given, I went and gave a talk at the IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, I think, a few months ago. And I met people who were in charge of like cybersecurity for major financial institutions. And I was like, how many times do you get like hacked per day? And they were like, per day? Try like per minute. Like we are constantly every passing minute, every major data system in the world is getting hacked for geopolitical reasons. China's hacking the US, Iran is hacking Israel, Israel is hacking Russia, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on and on. And a lot of times, these hacks are precursors to on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground military invasions. So for instance, Russia very famously hacked Ukraine's utilities infrastructure before it mounted the military campaign against Ukraine. And also, OSINT operatives were tracking Russian soldiers' movements before they entered into Ukraine's space. So this goes in both ways. Another interesting, that's a kind word to use for it, consequence of the secret life of data for democracy is discursive. So very famously, Aristotle, for those of you in the COM program, you probably learned about this in COM 101, Aristotle identified 3 ways to make a persuasive message. And the whole idea is you have to combine logos, which is kind of rational argumentation, with ethos, which means you can trust that I'm capable of making rational argumentation, with pathos, which means I'm going to give you an emotional reason to be invested in my rational argumentation. Because of data systems, we have this new modality of political persuasion that has basically done away with logos and ethos altogether and is 100% pure pathos. And one of the stories we tell in the book is the story of Cambridge Analytica, which, like the Snowden story, has kind of been remembered in this one-dimensional way and is so much more messed up than you actually remember it being. But basically, Cambridge Analytica weaponized big data about people's emotional state using a variety of inputs, including Facebook quizzes. They ran hundreds of thousands and ultimately tens of millions of Americans' individual data surveillance profiles through a psychological test called OCEAN. And the N in OCEAN stands for neurotic. So they found people who had a neurotic propensity to respond to negative agitprop. And then they would surround those people across multiple media, not just on Facebook, but on digital radio and on streaming, across as many media as were targetable, with self-corroborating agitprop disinformation campaigns to make them believe that this was not only true, but that only Donald Trump could stave off the coming apocalypse. And one of the data sources that they used, it's very well known that they used Facebook quizzes. One of the other ones was an app called Gloo, Gloo, which is an app that was created in order to allow survivors of sexual abuse by religious leaders to communicate with one another and seek reparations and seek healing. And Gloo inked a deal with Cambridge Analytica to basically leak all of the private chats between all these people who had been sexually abused by religious figures in their lives so that they could then be targeted, and then people who had similar behaviors could be retargeted on social media platforms, right? So heavy weaponization of people's pre-existing capacity to respond neurotically to alarming information. So where does this all leave us? We identify in the book 4 kind of longer-term crises that we know are coming and we don't know what to do about them. I will go through them briefly, and then I'll end on a ray of hope. One of them is this concept of social credit. Again, China has been ahead of the curve on this, but the basic concept of a social credit system is that all of these different disparate data inputs lead to a combined score, and that score determines whether you can do things like get a loan, get a travel visa, get access to education, get access to healthcare, what have you, right? It is a ranking algorithm for your patriotism, essentially, for your value to the state that has very, very real consequences for people's quality of life. And by the way, this is a hotly contested subject, and different scholars and journalists have reported different things about the architecture and the consequences of this system. So I want to acknowledge that as I talk about it. But again, China was out ahead on this, but like the ethnic alarms, America is doing the same thing, but we're doing it in the private sector through this very well-documented affiliation of different private actors in different sectors who are basically constructing this on the back end. And the beginning of that process was the actual credit score. But some of the same data brokerage institutions are now busy building these dossiers on us, and that has been accelerated, by the way, by the introduction of generative AI, which is, if nothing else, a phenomenal dossier building machine. Another challenge that we see coming, and maybe this is something that y'all have talked about here, is the quantum cliff. So we are now probably 2 or 3 years max away from really powerful quantum computers being available to large corporations and wealthy states. And those quantum computers are going to be really good at decrypting encrypted information. Now, there are new quantum encryption algorithms, but things can't be retroactively quantum encrypted. Now, if you remember from the beginning of my talk, I talked about how the cost of data storage has come down by 99%. So there are all these actors right now who, for the past 5, 10, 15 years, state actors, commercial actors, criminal actors, who collect all the encrypted data that are passing around the open internet that are only private because they're encrypted. They're on the open internet where anybody can intercept them, and they are storing all those data, all of your private chats, all of your medical records, all of your pornography watching habits, whatever may be valuable at some point, and they are saving those encrypted data on a hard drive in a server farm against the day sometime in 2017 or 2027 or 28 or 29 when they have the quantum computing power to decrypt all of those data. And whoever wins that race is going to have not only like blackmail bounty for every person in Congress and the Senate and business boards and leadership, but is going to be able to apply all of these surveillance-based techniques that I've been talking about throughout the talk to every human being on the planet. Because the depth of those data and the specificity of those data are so much greater and so much more sensitive than everything that's been collected by data brokerages to date. And that day is coming very, very, very soon. And we have no idea what kinds of consequences it's going to wreak. I mean, think about how tied up in knots Congress has been over the Epstein files for the last year, right? This is like Epstein times a quintillion that we're about to see. Okay, augmented and virtual reality. Very famously, Meta renamed itself after the metaverse, which was, if you've read William Gibson, like a really dumb thing to do. But I'm sorry, did I say William Gibson? I mean Neil Stephenson, thank you. William Gibson invented the term cyberspace. Neil Stephenson invented the metaverse in his book, Snow Crash. Anyway, there have been tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars invested in augmented and mixed reality in recent years, and thankfully, consumers have not yet bitten. We haven't found the killer app for it, but when we do, that is going to increase the volume of data surveillance geometrically, because these are systems that rely on micro cues about your the position of your eyes, the position of your body, your affective representation, what you're paying attention to, your attentional data. These are much more, the more all-encompassing these systems are in order to have specificity in their ability to represent reality, the greater amount of data gets collected. So I'm very concerned about the long-term consequences of that, if and when it takes off. And last but not least, and I'm less and less concerned about this as the billionaire weirdos get more and more concerned about it, but artificial general intelligence may or may not be happening, and if it does happen, it's going to make all of this other stuff seem like peanuts by comparison. But I'm so not worried about that right now, and we can talk about that during Q&A. I really think AI has already blown its whole. I think it's done what it's going to do. First order consequences. Okay, so why should we not just crawl into bed and pull the covers over our head? The short answer is because we have power. One thing that Jesse and I talk about in the book is, this is a new idea that we've coined in the book. We call it triangulation. And the basic idea is this. A lot of data systems use what the social theorist Donna Haraway called the God trick. Like, you ever notice, like on Google Maps, you look down, it's always daytime? You go anywhere around the globe, it's daytime. And you're looking from one specific direction. You never see the far side of a building that you've got like the 2.5D view of, right? All of data systems are the same way. They present this illusion of kind of seamless, top-down transparency into data subjects. But in order to produce that illusion of seamlessness, you have to hide a lot of data, and you have to fudge a lot of data. And a great example is this system called ShotSpotter, which puts microphones in like on urban streets, and if somebody fires a gun, it tells you, like, it triangulates where the gunshot came from and tells the police. And then they can go and arrest the suspect. The problem is that ShotSpotter has credibly been caught over and over again fudging their own data to match the police's version of events. Oh, ShotSpotter heard 3 shots fired, police said it was 6. Oh, wait, maybe we were wrong, it was 6 shots. And it didn't come from that corner, it came from that house, right? And the reason that can happen is because ShotSpotter has a completely self-enclosed data system that has one source, one input, and one output, and an opaque algorithm between the two. But there's all kinds of data systems where there are multiple inputs that have not only competing but conflicting points of view. And those systems are architected in a way to make that a strength rather than a weakness. So we talk about a lot of these citizen science projects like the Global Fireball Observatory, FathomNet, that use, like tens or hundreds of thousands of individual cell phones to figure out like where meteors are falling, or whether, where trees are dying in a rainforest, or which birds are migratory and where and at what time. And we believe that all these data systems can be re-architected in a way that's multi-perspectival in the same way, and that would engender a much more horizontal power structure surrounding the social consequences of data. Another glimmer of hope that we see is, some countries and regions, like these ones, have passed various laws limiting the power of organizations to collect and deploy data. The US has tried to do that. With the aid of some civil society organizations like CDT, the Biden White House and the Office of Science and Technology Policy came out with this great blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights back in 2023, and they actually unveiled data privacy legislation based on that in 2024. That has effectively been killed in the US. Again, a lot of it is just the incredible state of dysfunction of our policy machinery, but a lot of it is also lobbying from big tech companies, which have basically weakened the bills to the point where they're unpassable by, for instance, by requiring that the federal bills preempt stronger state bills that are already protecting privacy in places like California. And very recently, thankfully for me, Maryland. We see new aesthetics and ethics emerging among people. I mentioned OSINT before, the people who figured out that Russia was going to invade Ukraine before they ever crossed the border. OSINT is this distributed research ethic that has allowed citizen journalists and citizen investigators to unearth all kinds of abuses of power. And there are even some journalism organizations like Bellingcat that have built themselves on top of this OSINT network. Participatory design is a model that we talk a lot about in the book as a potential palliative. And the idea here is just that people who are disproportionately affected by the secret life of data should have a role in shaping how those systems work, to make sure that they don't suffer those disproportionate harms so that someone else can benefit. AI literacy, I've already talked about like the negative consequences for teenage girls about social media use, but also there are all these amazing accounts that are teaching literacy inside of the apps to those same users. So they're able to see when Photoshop or other tools are being used to, for instance, present unattainable body images. And then there's this concept called data justice and data sovereignty, which has begun to percolate up through kind of policy scholarship in recent years. It hasn't, I participated in a G20 event last year about indigenous data sovereignty. Only once we build the language for these concepts can we actually begin to build the policies that will enact them. But this notion that because there are disproportionate and disparate consequences of data systems for different communities, those communities should be able to direct how data is used within themselves. And again, we can talk about this during Q&A if you want, but there's a really good policy roadmap for how ideas like this can actually become actionable. And then there are technological interventions. I don't know about you guys, I use a VPN on every device. I wasn't doing that 10 years ago. I use Signal to chat with my wife. I wasn't doing that 3 years ago. More and more and more people are adopting these technologies. There are interventions, technological interventions, like indigenous-centric AI repositories, model cards that track the intrinsic biases of different data systems, and then algorithmic audits, which again could ladder up to policy measures that would require audits, so that in the same way that we know, like when we buy some cookies, whether they have sawdust in them or not, when we fire up an AI model, we should know whether it's going to present you with a racist stereotype or not. So I'll leave you with this. Jesse and I interviewed something like 30 people over the course of writing this book, and at the end of each interview with all these domain experts, we would say, knowing what you now know, as an expert in your field, if you wanted to wreak havoc in society, what is the worst thing that you could possibly do? And almost without fail, these experts were like, oh, I never thought of that. And so what we argue is that everybody needs to start thinking like a supervillain, because you can rest assured that someone is going to weaponize the secret life of data to cause maximal harm to you for their maximal benefit. And only if we proactively think about what's the worst thing that could possibly happen will we be able to architect these systems, these cultures, these technologies, and these policies in a way that will minimize the chance of those harms. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you so much. And there's been action on Zoom, so I'll start with a Zoom question, then we'll throw it out to the audience here. And actually, before we get to Zoom, I wanted to ask one thing about your book title. Like, I get the secret part of data. Yeah. That's very clear. Why life? Like, because life sort of implies that there's an end, but your book really makes this strong point that like it could go on forever. So just wondering, like, why life?
Because it was catchy.
Catchy.
We
okay.
actually, we were also thinking of using the term data afterlives, and we ended up naming the conclusion chapter of the book Data Afterlives for exactly that reason.
Okay, right on. All right, so from Zoom, they're just wondering about how tech development has gone to this point where it seems to have taken on a destructive power, and I think your last slide sort of like highlights that potential. Why? Do you think this stems from the internal logic of tech progress itself or the distribution of power?
I love that question. Thank you to whoever asked it on Zoom. I would say I think of data as a force multiplier. Humanity's capacity for cruelty and destruction and our lust for power have existed as long as ancient literature has existed, at least. But we were very limited in our capacity to seek and exercise power because of the limits of the human sensorium. Something I like to talk about when I have a longer talk is state surveillance probably reached its apogee in the kind of post-war Eastern Bloc, where you had secret police like the Stasi who would like trail people down the street and report on them to the authorities. But there was a limit to the power of that because only one person could follow one person at a time. So you couldn't follow everybody all the time. But because data is a force multiplier, and because we now have these algorithmic tools like generative AI that can essentially integrate multiple databases and then on demand generate a dossier, that limit on the surveillance power of bad actors has completely evaporated. That's one example of what I think is a larger truism, which is that for every form of social institution or social power dynamic that we have spent so much of the last few hundred years creating systems to ameliorate, all of those stopgaps and safeguards are now worthless in the face of the multiplicative power of data systems.
Do we have a question from the room? Yeah, up front here, Liz.
Well, first off, thank you. Hold on 1 second for the mic.
Sorry.
Thank you for your talk. I really like the last ending slide because I work in cybersecurity, and that's really the pen testing philosophy is like think like a hacker, and then sort of reverse engineer the solution from the vulnerability. So I had one question about where you see government surveillance going in the future. You talked about NSA and Snowden and how he revealed that the government was illegally spying on citizens. And nowadays, I believe the approach has sort of been, well, what if we just privatize this and like delegate the spying out to Palantir? And I believe that like the former Prime Minister of Israel met with Epstein on a company that was supposed to sell to police stations for monitoring and collecting data.
Yep.
What laws are in place to protect the general public from harvesting from corporations? Because I believe the approach is if private companies are doing it, it's okay. So can you speak to that?
I can absolutely speak to that. So I have a friend who passed away a few years ago who was a retired SIGINT analyst for the NSA. And once he got to know me and trust me, he would talk to me about his time there and his perspective on these issues. And I remember about 10 years ago, we were talking about location data brokers, and he said to me something along the lines of, it was because for those of you who are not ancient like me, like during the Bush 2 years, like back in 2003, 2004, there was a huge metadata surveillance scandal. It turned out that the NSA was collecting telephone and internet metadata about communications between Americans in the wake of 9/11 without a warrant. And they went to court and they ended up losing. And that was somewhat curtailed, but American telecommunications companies like Verizon had been like enthusiastic participants in this metadata surveillance program. So the commercial end of it has been known for a while, but what my friend, the former SIGINT analyst, told me was basically like the way that the NSA and other three-letter agencies had dealt with the court rulings post-Bush years was by basically going to the open market and buying all of the data that they would have collected themselves prior to that. So they didn't ever stop doing mass data surveillance, they just shifted it to the private sector. And I think that was the case until January of this year. And now, with the Dojification of the US government, first of all, the line between public and private has completely eroded, right? Like, is Doge a government agency? Was Elon Musk, a representative of the US government or not? Big questions, obviously not an answer. But if you look at what he's been doing, and it's not just him, it's Peter Thiel and Palantir, as you point out, but these systems are now being integrated into the federal bureaucracy. So the main thing that Doge did, other than laying off a ton of essential federal workers, was to collect and combine data from all these different federal agencies that had been siloed from each other for very good reasons, as long as they'd existed, and to integrate them into a single database. There's a term for it, and I'm not remembering it. Doesn't matter. But it's something that's been done for, fusion, intelligence fusion, data fusion. Creating these data fusion systems where, for instance, like the IRS and the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services could all now share data with each other, and they could do much more effective surveillance and dossier building on individual citizens based on that combination of data. And the lasting consequence of DOGE, I think even more than the destruction of laying off all these federal workers, is the full-scale collection, scraping of all this federal data, and then putting it into private hands that we now have no insight into. So every day you read it's on like page 93 of the newspaper, but some new data system purveyed by one of these military industrial information complex companies.
Oh, it seemed lost.
By one of these military industrial information complex companies has now been inked a $N billion contract with the federal government. So the answer is it's both public and private now, and the line between the two is blurred.
All right, one last question over here.
Thank you again for excellent discussion. As we talked about before, the propagation of misinformation and the amplification of misinformation all get stored. How do we deal with that? In 10 words or less.
The only reason that misinformation and disinformation are so powerful is because the social institutions that have been responsible for trust and authenticity were already broken. So, to me, the most important example of that is the news industry and the field of journalism, where, 30, 40 years ago, America had, every city in America had, multiple competing local newspapers. And in the years since then, in part because of federal deregulation, and in part because of the rapacious behaviors of private equity and venture capital, and in part because of the arrogance and self-interest of American plutocrats, there's almost no more independent journalism, and there are no journalists on the ground covering school board meetings and police departments and exposing corruption where it starts, and creating a trustworthy narrative in the public sphere that everybody can agree upon. And as a result, I think of that, and it really began with cable television, and then was accelerated by deregulation in the mid-90s under Clinton. It's not a left and right, blue and red issue. We had, for instance, the vaccine panics, which have now become federal policy, and so on and so forth. So I think really, and this is what Jesse's and my next book is going to be about, so I'm glad you asked this question. Jesse and I have this term that actually came out of doing these book talks. It's not in this book. It's called data kindness. And the whole idea is that the same way that, for instance, when you go to someone's house for dinner, they'll ask you, what are you allergic to? What don't you eat? Are you vegan? Are you kosher? Are you halal? Are you gluten intolerant? And then they'll serve your needs based on that. That was not the case when I was growing up in this country. I would go to my friend's house, and his mom would put down peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in front of us, and we would eat them, and we'd get yelled at if we didn't, right? So how did we get to that point? It's actually a really long and interesting process that begins with grassroots data collection and advocacy, ladders up to policy, then becomes institutional change, and then becomes common knowledge and standard practice. And we think the same thing can and should and will happen when it comes to the harms of the secret life of data. That the more we universally acknowledge that the data exists and that the harms exist, the more we can push through that same kind of process to normalize a set of kinder data relations where we are not presumptively surveillance, where we are not presumptively distrustful, where we're agreeing on what data matter, how to collect them, under what circumstances to use them, and being more transparent about our data practices with one another becomes as normal as asking someone whether they're allergic to peanuts or whether they're gluten-free. But we're gonna have to rebuild civil society, and we're not gonna be able to do that until the current political mayhem is over.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Aram for a really insightful, innovative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
And please join us next week when we have Leo Burstein from the University of Chicago. He's an economist that I think has a really important and novel take on how to think about social media and its value. All right. See you next week.